someone who really knows what she's talking about, and the topic certainly couldn't be more relevant. Anne started in philosophy as an undergrad at St. Francis College in Brooklyn, got her PhD at CUNY at the City University of New York, did a lot of teaching there while she was working on the degree, and for several years after. Got to teach several years after that at her alma mater, St. Francis, and then came to Emory in '84. So I'm sure a lot of you know Anne well. So I was very excited to learn that she was willing to talk to us about Montaigne today. Most of the, well, I don't know if we can say great books she herself has done, but the pretty darn good books she herself has done have focused on Montaigne. There was a big one in 2003, Cambridge University Press, a big one in 2013, Northwestern University Press. And right now, she, with help, I might mention, of a Hartle grant from the Emeritus College and the College of Arts and Sciences, she's working on yet another book on Montaigne. And so I'll turn it over to our teacher for the day. What a way to start the year. Over to Anne. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you very much, Gretchen. Is the mic okay? Not too, all right, thank you. Funny, I had that same dream. What a coincidence. Except in my dream, everybody walked out.
Oh, yes.
So, hang in there.
We can really freak her out. We just all stood and left.
Well, my topic today is the virtue of civility, recovering the lost virtue of civility. Over the past few decades, we've often heard calls for greater civility in our public discourse. And on the other hand, we've also heard very often that calls for civility are really attempts to silence people and to shut down free speech. And I think both of those are true. We have lost, civility has declined a great deal, and sometimes accusing one's opponent of incivility is an attempt to silence him or her, and as if disagreement itself is uncivil. And increasingly, attempts to reconcile those two points of view have led to restrictions on free speech codes, for example, which are intended to protect everybody from being offended. So even on college campuses, where we might expect the greatest freedom of speech, the tendency now is to talk about safe spaces and trigger warnings and so forth. So what I would like to claim is that that conflict between civility and free speech cannot be resolved on the level of a code of conduct. Why? Because civility is not a set of rules, it's a virtue, it's a character, it's a habitual disposition towards others and the way we speak to them. And we'll talk more about what underlies that virtue of civility as we get further into Montaigne. If we want to understand what civility is, I think one way to do it, and I think actually the best way to do it, is to go back to the origin of civility, which is in Montaigne's essays. He's the first to give expression to this virtue, because it is a new virtue, which only comes into play in the 16th century with Montaigne. That doesn't mean that people before that were uncivil to each other, and what it means is that civility is a virtue that becomes necessary and possible in the new liberal order. Civility is a virtue that belongs to the liberal order, liberalism. Now, when I use the term liberalism, I'm not talking about our current debates between left and right. I'm talking about classical liberalism, beginning in the modern era, beginning with Machiavelli and Montaigne and Hobbes, for example. Right? And what that is will come out when we look at some of the things that Montaigne has to say. So the character, what I'm saying is the civil character is first given expression in the essays of Montaigne, and that the essays of Montaigne are themselves an act of civility. Now let me say a few words about Montaigne himself. Montaigne was born in 1533 to a family of the minor nobility in Bordeaux. At the age of 24, he had finished his formal education, and he became a counselor in the Parliament of Bordeaux, which was not a legislative body, but a judicial body. During the 13 years that he served in that parliament, the civil wars, religious and civil wars, broke out in France between Catholics and Protestants. Montaigne remained a Catholic through the civil wars, but he was very critical of both sides for their violent conduct. And he was so well trusted by both sides that he became the mediator between Henry III and Henry of Navarre and negotiated between them. He was also elected mayor of Bordeaux, which is a big deal, for 2 terms. His father had been mayor and he was elected mayor, and so he had political experience. And he died on September 13th, 1592. Now, I should mention, for those of you who are interested in wine, good wine, I heard conversations earlier, that the chateau of Montaigne is where now Chateau d'Yquem is produced. The family name was actually d'Yquem. And in fact, when Thomas Jefferson was minister to France, he visited the chateau. I'm getting this now from Wikipedia. Very reliable source, but when Thomas Jefferson visited the chateau, he wrote, "This is the best white wine of France." And he bought 250 bottles of the 1784 vintage for himself, and he bought some for George Washington. So it's a very good wine, but if you think about buying it, you need to bring your credit card. It's also very expensive. So, all right, so when Montaigne was 38 years old, he retired from his position in Parliament to his chateau, and he began to write essays, what were called essays. And in fact, he invented that genre of the essay, at least in its modern form. So I would want to claim that he invented the genre because he had something new to say that could not be said in any of the existing genres of philosophy. And that's what we want to talk about today. I want to say a few words first about modern philosophy in general. Modern philosophy what we call modern philosophy in the history of philosophy, which doesn't exactly overlap with political history. Modern philosophy begins in the 16th century with Machiavelli and Montaigne and Bacon and then Descartes. So there are two, might say, strains of modern philosophy. One, the epistemological theory of knowledge strain, which is all about modern science, or it's the epistemology behind modern science. And we could talk about that in the question period if there are scientists here who would like to talk about that. The other strain is in political philosophy and political and moral philosophy. And that is what I described before as the beginnings of liberalism. Right? Montaigne, I think, is really at the source, not the only source, but he is at the source of both of these strains of modern philosophy. But we will focus today on the moral and political aspects of the essays. The essays are a new genre because they express a new moral character. And that is what we could call the civil character. So I thought it would help the handout that you have with the 8 quotations. I thought it would help to kind of structure what I have to say around these quotations. And then after that, I'll make a few concluding remarks. Okay, so the first quotation, these are all from Donald Frame's translation of the essays, and if you feel inspired to read the essays, it's an excellent translation. It's sort of the standard one used in English. Okay, so the first quotation. Since philosophy has not been able to find a way to the good that is common, let each one seek it in his particularity. Okay. The virtue of civility does not appear in, say, Aristotle's Ethics. There are many virtues that do appear there and that are necessary for political life: justice, courage, moderation, and so forth. And Aristotle also talks about what he calls political friendship. Hard to believe, but political friendship is the bond that he talks about among the citizens of the city, and it is very much tied to notions of justice, but particularly it's tied to the notion of the common good. Pre-modern, that is classical and medieval political philosophy and practice, were dominated by the principle of the common good. Not that it was always achieved, but it was the standard of judgment, how you judged a political society, how you judged a political regime, was according to the principle of the common good. Now, we hear that term thrown around a lot. Anybody who wants to justify a particular policy will say, well, this is for the common good, so suck it up and get used to it. This is what we need to do for the common good. But that is a very loose and imprecise meaning of the common good. What Aristotle means by the common good is a very strong notion of the common good. It means a good that can only be pursued in common. You can't pursue it by yourself, because it has to do with this notion of political friendship, right? So it's not a private morality, right? It's very much a public morality. And the community, the city, is a moral community. That doesn't mean they were moral. It doesn't mean that human beings then were just wonderful and perfect and virtuous. Not at all. But again, what it does mean is that the standard is the same for everybody, and you can fall short of that standard. And there's a lot of political disagreement over what justice was and how justice was to be achieved. So I'm not trying to paint a rosy picture of pre-modern political life. But modern political philosophy, and Montaigne in particular, reject the standard of the common good. And that's what's going on in that first quote. Since philosophy has not been able to find a way to the good that is common, let each one seek it in his particularity. That's the first principle of liberalism. The freedom of the individual to pursue the good as he sees it. It's a private notion of the good, the privatization of the good. Now, Montaigne's essays are the first appearance of this individual. In other words, it's with the essays that the individual, in the modern sense, I mean, people, of course, people were always individuals, right? But this is the individual in the modern sense who is not an integral part of a community. He's pursuing the good on his own. Right? So it's what I would call the incommensurable individual. That is to say, there's no common measure for judging what people are and how they should live, what the individual is. So if we look at the second quote, this is very, to my mind, striking. I do not share that common error of judging another by myself. I easily believe that another man may have qualities different from mine. Because I feel myself tied down to one form, I do not oblige everybody to espouse it, as all others do. I believe in and conceive 1,000 contrary ways of life. And in contrast with the common run of men, I more easily admit difference than resemblance between us. I am as ready as you please to acquit another man from sharing my conditions and principles. I consider him simply in himself, without relation to others. I mold him to his own model. I have a singular desire that we should each be judged in ourselves apart, and that I may not be measured in conformity with the common examples. It's a very strong notion of individuality where there's no common measure for judging others. So the question is, what is individuality? What is an individual? And how do we become individuals? This is not just something that happens by nature. You're not an individual just by kind of showing up, right? It has to be achieved. Individuality is an achievement. And it's an achievement of education. So if we look at the third quote, this is from his work on the education of children, the essay on the education of children. Okay, he's talking, the bees plunder the flowers here and there, but afterwards they make of them honey, which is all theirs. It is no longer thyme or marjoram. Even so, with the pieces borrowed from others, that is what you learn from the tradition, the student will transform and blend them to make a work that is all his own. That is, his judgment. His education, work, and study aim only at forming this. So one's judgment is one's individuality. It's the only thing that is all your own, if I read this correctly. And And this is what education must aim at, the formation of judgment. Now, the comparison that I would like to make is I've read many books over the years on liberal education, what it's all about, what's the purpose of liberal education. And what you hear over and over and over again is liberal education is about fostering critical thinking. Well, that's a very, to my mind, impoverished notion of what liberal education is. Critical thinking is what it says it is. It destroys. It's meant to destroy, for example, I recently read Martha Nussbaum's book on liberal education, and there she says over and over again, critical thinking is about rejecting the tradition, right? Rejecting the great books, right? Whereas what Montaigne is describing here is learning the tradition and making it your own, right? Appropriating it in your own way. So this is the notion of individuality that we're working with here in Montaigne, and in talking about each pursuing the good in his particularity. Now, the second principle of liberalism. How did all these individuals, each going their own way, how do they live together? Right? Think about all the clashes that are bound to happen with these atoms colliding with each other, right? So the second principle of liberalism is the rule of law. So we have one way to understand civility, and we'll talk more about this later. One way to understand civility is the commitment or the willingness to live under the law. In other words, law alone is not enough. You have to be willing to live under it. If you're not willing to live under it, then law cannot do what it's supposed to do. The other thing about the law is not meant to form your character. Right? It's simply meant to prohibit you from, in these clashes of individuals, from hurting each other, right? So law alone is not enough. You have these two principles of liberalism that are really dependent on something more fundamental. And that's where the virtue of civility comes in. Not a common human nature. The unity of these individuals is not due to a common human nature. Right? It's got to be due to something more fundamental. So if we look at our fourth quote, since mutual understanding is brought about solely by way of the word, he who falsifies it betrays human society. It is the only instrument by means of which our wills and thoughts communicate. It is the interpreter of our soul. If it fails us, we have no more hold on each other, no more knowledge of each other. If it deceives us, it breaks up all our relations and dissolves all the bonds of society. So the social bond is this keeping one's word. Promise keeping, right? Now, but the basic promise, the fundamental promise, is to live under the laws, right? So he goes on, lying is such a destructive vice because we are men and hold together only by our word. Truth is the first and fundamental part of virtue, and the first stage in the corruption of morals is the banishment of truth. Okay, so so what he's talking about here is the social bond is communication, and it has to be open communication, right? And in fact, I don't have the quote here, but Montaigne refers to his character. One of the terms he uses most often to refer to his character is openness, frankness. Right? So civility requires this openness. And so we see the spirit in which he enters into discussion. And this is quote number 5. I do not at all hate opinions contrary to mine. I am so far from being vexed to see discord between my judgments and others. Now, you use the term judgment there, right? And from making myself incompatible with the society of men, because they are of a different sentiment and party from mine, that on the contrary, since variety is the most general fashion that nature has followed, and more in minds than in bodies, I find it much rarer to see our humors and designs agree, and there were never in the world 2 opinions alike, any more than 2 hairs or grains. Their most universal quality is diversity. This is from the essay on the art of discussion. Now notice, he's not talking about group identity. We're talking about individuals, right? And the diversity that he is celebrating here is not diversity of race, gender. It's diversity of minds, right? Diversity of opinion. And that's the most important kind of diversity. So classical liberalism is not about group identity at all. All right. Quote number 6. This is an elaboration on what he's just said. I enter into discussion and argument with great freedom and ease, inasmuch as opinion finds in me a bad soil to penetrate and take deep roots in. No propositions astonish me. No belief offends me. He's not easily offended, whatever contrast it offers with my own. So contradictions of opinions neither offend nor affect me. They merely arouse and exercise me. When someone opposes me, he arouses my attention, not my anger. So notice I was talking to a friend of mine a while back, and he was asking me what I was working on. I talked about civility, and he said, well, isn't civility just good manners? And I said, well, yeah, but if you start to look back behind good manners a little deeper, there's a moral character that has to be there, right? There's, for example, a certain restraint, right? That you don't become angry. Right? Or even if you feel anger, you restrain yourself. You don't express that anger. You give an argument, a judgment, right? Not just an expression of feeling. And it occurs to me in this context here, the poverty of our current vocabulary, public vocabulary, the poverty of it don't we have any other terms besides hate? Aren't there a few maybe more nuanced words we could use that might express a certain restraint, like I disapprove, I disagree? When you lose, the loss of the vocabulary itself, I think, is, or even the use of foul language. Right? It always strikes me, and it certainly strikes my students. You read Aristotle's Politics, and he has a line in there that is absolutely incredible to my students. He says, above all, the legislator must forbid foul language. It's like, good luck with that. Right? But it's a different world, of course it's a different world. But if you try to think that through, why he's saying that, and you think it through, you see the relationship between, if you don't have the restraint not to say certain things, right? It's a collapse of that restraint that's necessary for civil interaction. Okay, and now quote number 7. It is always a tyrannical ill humor to be
unable to endure a way of thinking different from your own. Tyrannical. Montaigne says, I hate tyranny in any form. Now, if words fail us, if you can't endure an opinion different from your own, if we can't do that, the only thing that's left is force.
Right. It's either persuasion through words and reasons and argument, or it's force. And we'll talk more about this later, but the more you have to call on the authority of the law, the less civility there is. Right? We'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, and finally, the last quote. I am perfect in forbearance, for I endure retaliation, not only sharp, but even indiscreet, without being disturbed. As I think that this is the only place in the essays where he ever calls himself perfect. So what he's describing here is what might be called a kind of generosity of spirit, this openness. And you see what's involved here also, a willingness to forgive insults, to forgive slights and offenses, in that give and take of open speech. You have to be willing to forgive. And this is just a tough skin. You have to have a tough skin in order to engage in discussion the way he describes it. And if civility is the sort of foundation of liberal political life, then this is really essential to have that tough skin. Now, I'd like to just by way of conclusion, talk a little bit more about what civility entails. Civility includes trust and respect. Now, maybe it includes a lot more than that too, but those are the two things I want to focus on. But what does trust mean? The kind of trust we're talking about is trust that depends on being held together by something stronger than politics. what's been called a pre-political loyalty to one's fellow citizens. And this is tacit, at least tacit. A tacit agreement to abide by norms that constrain our choices without coercing them. But that's an internal constraint. They're just things you don't say. They're just things you don't do. Trust is Montaigne's openness, I would say. The trust necessary for openness of communication. How you regard the other person, even if he is a stranger. We have to be able to trust, have confidence that the other person will act in a civil way towards us. It's a mutual confidence. Civility requires a mutual confidence that the interaction is going to go a certain way. Not that the outcome of the argument will go a certain way, but that we will cede to each other, and that's the way the conversation is going to go. Now, I want to appeal to, actually, most of the work that's been done on the study of civility has been done by sociologists, not in philosophy. So there's a sociologist named Adam Seligman who wrote an essay called Trust, Confidence, and the Problem of Civility. And what Seligman argues is that civility assumes the freedom of individuals, and that the existence of a civil, free society depends upon trust. And trust implies risk, because the other individual is free to choose how to react. Trust is the way we negotiate risk. The risk, he says, that's inherent in the other person's agency. Okay, so Seligman uses the example of the etiquette of smoking in the days before you couldn't smoke almost anywhere. Emory is a smoke-free environment. He uses the etiquette of smoking as an example of the way agency, risk, and trust function in a civil society. Before the laws, the days of laws governing where it was permissible to smoke, he, Seligman, would ask permission to light up, right? He'd ask those around him, do you mind if I smoke? And if they said, yeah, we'd rather you didn't smoke, he doesn't smoke. He restrains himself. Not because there's a law that tells him he has to, but because he's considerate of others. So this is the kind of, he says, this is what he says, by voluntarily refraining from smoking and so circumscribing my will in favor of the interests of a stranger, I was establishing, in however passing, fleeting, and inconsequential a matter, I was establishing a social bond. Right? That's it. Might seem like a trivial example, but it's a good example of this civility as this social bond. So the act of asking permission to smoke is a recognition of the choice that the other must make, either to conform or not to conform to my wishes. We thus recognize his agency, his being a moral agent, and in so doing, we recognize his selfhood. Trust is the beginning of respect for the other because we acknowledge his freedom, his ability to judge, and his individuality. Now, this brings in the issue of the law. Now we have all kinds of restrictions on where it is permissible to smoke. Now, as I say, Emory prides itself on being smoke-free. But I remember a few years ago reading, I guess in one of the campus publications, that there were going to be monitors to check on if people were smoking. And I know behind my building, Bowden Hall, people would go out, and I have great sympathy for this because I smoked for a very, very long time. And I remember the days when you could smoke just about anywhere. But people would go out and they're hiding behind the bushes and they're having their smoke. And I'm thinking, monitors, really? That just struck me as being really Big Brother. And my reaction was, well, are we going to have sex monitors in the dorms, folks? Is that going to be next? Would you like that? Anyway, sorry. So the point being that the more laws, the fewer opportunities for civility and for the development of civility. The more it takes those choices away from you, right? And the opportunities away from you, because it's all being handled at a different level, at a level of law. So the more you substitute the force of law, which is an external constraint on conduct, for the exercise of self-restraint. Civility cannot be legislated, because civility is what makes it possible to live under law. It's more basic than law. A character has to be formed to produce law-abiding citizens. Secondly, civility requires respect for the other person. But what does respect mean? And here I'm going to call on the help of another sociologist, Edwin Delattre, who wrote an essay called Civility and the Limits of the Tolerable. Delattre is critical of the prevalent idea that tolerance and being non-judgmental are the highest virtues, and that judging others or their ways of thinking, feeling, and acting is itself uncivil. And I don't know about others of you who have taught undergraduates, but I can tell you this is the pervasive view. It's wrong to make any judgments, right, of other people. That's immoral. Right? The highest virtue is tolerance and being non-judgmental. Now compare that with Montaigne, who's talking about judgment, right, as what you are, in effect, is how you judge. On the contrary, Delattre says, these ideas about the highest virtue are actually destructive of civility, because there is an essential difference between respect and non-judgmental tolerance. Tolerance normally presupposes judgment in the sense that we tolerate what we think is wrong, that we don't approve of it. That's why we tolerate it. It's not the same as approval, right? But on the other hand, we also don't think that we should interfere. So certain things you might tolerate means you don't do anything to stop them. And other things you have to stop, right? You feel you have to stop. But Delattre says that the idea that being civil means being non-judgmentally tolerant reduces civility to what he calls a demeaning sensitivity. Demeaning. Never offending anyone. We see this demeaning sensitivity in the substitution of my report about my feelings for a normative assertion and a judgment. In other words, I'm not comfortable with this versus I judge this to be wrong for the following reasons, right? And Delatre's claim is that I'm not comfortable with this can't be criticized. You can't tell me, oh yeah, you are comfortable with it. You can't criticize that statement, but you can criticize a statement or an action on rational grounds. So he says this exclusion of reason from discourse is uncivil. That's uncivil, although it's often claimed to be the height of civility, right? And Delatre says, when civility becomes a sensitivity that casts aside regard for the truth, it bears little resemblance to civility understood as liberal learning and the discourse appropriate to civilized people. He says, genuine respect for others is not coddling them and their sensitivities. That is demeaning because that treats them as a fragile victim, too delicate to bear criticism, right? It's demeaning. Genuine respect for others is to regard them and treat them as moral agents themselves and as intelligent human beings who have the willingness and the strength to bear disagreement and criticism. I'll tell you one story. I taught a freshman seminar on this topic, what is civility? And this business about criticism came up. And the overwhelming reaction of the students was how wrong it is to ever criticize people. And one girl, a very, very smart girl, I can call them girls at my age, one girl said that in her school, the practice was that the teachers were not permitted to use red pen to grade essays because it was just too upsetting. It was too, and I could hardly believe that. Really, I said, really? You are kidding me. That's the kind of thing he's talking about here, that to really be civil, you have to regard the other person as at least possibly an intelligent human being who is able to listen to criticism and to give criticism back, right? So I do conclude now with the following. The title of my talk was Restoring Civility. So I only have two very little modest things to say about that. And I'm talking mostly again about the universities. And the first thing I would say would be openness to different opinions, Montaigne's openness. And that means not preventing invited speakers from speaking on campus. Protest is fine. Violent protest and preventing speakers from speaking is not civil. That is really uncivil. And the one thing that could be done in universities is to insist on that, to not permit speakers from being prevented from speaking. And also, of course, no speech codes. would be another way to foster civility. The second thing would be seeing liberal education as fostering not critical thinking, but forming judgment. And that would mean, at least in certain disciplines in the humanities, something like the tradition, the great books, for forming judgment. That's how Montaigne formed his judgment. You read the essays, there's hundreds of philosophers, poets, historians. You know, Montaigne says history is the skeleton of philosophy. Right? That's how he formed his judgment on the tradition of the humanity. Now, he broke with that tradition in a very radical way. Liberalism is a great break with the tradition, right? But it's the only place to start. So I hope that you will see Montaigne as the kind of person that you'd like to sit down and have a beer with, or better yet, he might offer you a glass of Chateau d'Yquem. Thank you.
Oh, we have half an hour, and I think, you know, as many opinions in the room as there are people in the room. I'm going to give this to Brooke. I see his hand up, and then we can pass it over to Trivia, and John will run around with it, okay? We need to do this because otherwise anything you say isn't picked up on the webcast, okay? So John will be our runaround boy.
Thank you, Anne. That was really wonderful. Would Montaigne say that when you engage another person with whom you strongly disagree, that you are morally obligated to express your disagreement?
I think that's a little bit too strong. I mean, it's easy to think of circumstances where, like, if you might disapprove of certain conduct very much, but you don't want to make it personal, right? So let's say you don't approve of homosexual marriage, let's just say, and you have friends who are homosexuals who are married. You're not going to go into their house and start an argument over what you're doing is wrong. You know, you're not picking. You don't want to pick a fight. But so I think the way you put it is a little bit too strong, right? I don't know whether that really answers.
I'm not sure I understood you, but did you say that that civility cannot be legislated?
Right.
I don't agree with that.
Okay.
Me, for example.
What do you mean you don't agree?
If there's a sign on the beach that said "Don't dump your garbage," it's uncivil to dump your garbage on the beach, and the government has seen that that's done. What's wrong with that?
Well, that's no longer civility. That's the law and its force. And
no, before the law was ever enacted, dumping garbage on
yeah,
the beach.
but should we really have to have signs on the beach to tell you not to dump your garbage?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, no, we might need to because of the lack of civility.
Yes, absolutely.
So I'm saying it's the more you have laws, the less civility there is, because you're trying to accomplish through the law what you shouldn't have to try to accomplish through the law.
But without that law, garbage gets dumped.
And with the law, it gets done.
Yeah, but it gets less done.
Hopefully, none of it's an effective law.
No, but see, I guess what I mean, civility is a virtue. What I'm saying is civility is a matter of judgment, right? And it's a matter of, think of it as tact, right? How to be tactful. That would be one aspect of civility, all right? You can't legislate that. You can't legislate it. You can be brought up that way.
There are aspects can, yeah, but it's too narrow definition of what is civility, in my opinion. Because it's not just tact, it's
No, that's
actions that are really very disagreeable. And the government has a right to stop that.
I don't disagree that it's a right. I'm saying that the more our actions and our discourse gets worked out on the level of opposing rights or rights, the more is lost in the realm of personal interactions, the freedom of the individual, the judgment of the... Now, we can bemoan that, and I'm not saying that... I mean, I assume everybody appreciates being able to live in a smoke-free environment. Fine. But what I'm saying is a lot gets lost in terms of personal virtue, in terms of personal freedom and interaction, the more legislation there is.
This sounds like Donald Trump. Really, that's what he's saying, and getting rid of all these regulations. They're supposed to maintain our health.
Well, maybe it does sound like him, but yet we would have to argue that, though, on the basis of what the reasons are.
Excuse me. What is the difference between ethics and civility? And also I have one more. Even before Montaigne, love thy neighbor was is it a civility standpoint or ethical standpoint?
See, I think the civility certainly does not account for all of morality, right? Because what happens with liberalism is the privatization of morality, right? Law, you often hear it says morality cannot be legislated. And I'm not disagreeing with that, because in a certain sense I want to say morality is the only thing that can be legislated. But in other words, justice, right? But so no, there is a kind of there's a lot more to morality than just civility. There's a lot more to ethics than just civility, right, for Montaigne. But civility is, we might say, sort of the glue. We're talking about civility as the kind of glue that holds us all together, right, as we each pursue the good in our own way. Does that make sense?
So it can be also same thing ethics. I should do this one, I should not do. Moral obligation comes in there.
Well, civility, for example, doesn't really say anything about what justice is. It doesn't say anything about courage, So there are a lot of things that civility as such does not cover about moral life, right? But it's the public, we might call it the public morality or the public the social bond that we have with each other.
One instance where I heard people use the civility in the diverse case when both husband and wife fight, they call it the law civility. So how.
I don't want to get into that.
Certain, that is so, that's what I was.
But, you know, look, there is a certain sense, I think, in which, you know, as my friend says, well, isn't civility just good manners? I cannot overstate how true it would be to say that civility requires good manners. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, yes. And if we had just good manners, it'd be great.
That is civility.
Yeah, yeah.
I had just one quick comment in relation to that. The heart of legal philosophy, probably the first part of legal philosophy, is exactly that question, whether or not you can, whether law has to be moral, or whether it's the positivist against the natural law people.
Right.
But that wasn't what I wanted to ask you. What I wanted to ask you had to do with Voltaire, who is a French, my memory of French philosophers is a little more hazy than it used to be. Did Voltaire draw on the work of Montaigne? Because he was thinking a lot of the same things with regard to the religious conflicts that were in France and indeed in Europe at that time.
Yeah. Now, it's a good question. Montaigne is in the early modern period, Voltaire in the Enlightenment period. Now that in itself doesn't tell you anything, but Montaigne, Hobbes, Machiavelli, these early modern political philosophers, all agree, even Rousseau, who is a sort of Enlightenment figure, agreed that religion is essential to social life. They might not have believed themselves, and certainly there's good reason to think Rousseau did not believe. But there's good reason to think that one reason that Montaigne remained a Catholic through the civil wars was that he thought religion was essential to the social bond. And a common religion was essential to the social bond. When you get to the Enlightenment, that really, that idea kind of disappears, right? So Rousseau, for example, I don't know Voltaire as well as I know Rousseau, but I think probably something similar is the case. Rousseau is very influenced by Montaigne, but in the end, you know, he's so far as he's an Enlightenment thinker, then the necessity for religion is still there, but you have much more of an idea of a completely secular society with the social contract. So.
I thank you because when I took Montaigne in my French school, I hardly understood it. So it took 70 years to understand. But because I'm a pediatrician and I wonder that there's too much philosophy to adults. And the problem we have starts with children. So, I mean, it's fine to talk about civility, etc., but children and so forth. How do you respond to a parent who wants you now to give your philosophical talk? And there is incidentally a book about philosophical babies. My God. I'm sorry.
Well, you know, I mentioned, and one of the quotations on the sheet was from Montaigne's essay on the education of children. So if I were to refer you to that, you know, you'd see the way he thinks children should be raised. And it's quite interesting, his views on education. And the freedom, Montaigne despised the French education system.
So did I.
So there, you've got a friend now. He really despised it. He despised the brutality of it. So there's a lot of good suggestions in that essay for raising your child as a civil human being. But, you know, that passage about judgment is from that essay, right? History, poetry, philosophy. And, you know, when you think about that, when you teach philosophy and you teach the tradition of philosophy, the history of philosophy, what you're doing is you're presenting all kinds of views. I mean, you can't get much more different than the difference between Aristotle and Hobbes, right? And so you might agree with one and disagree with the other. You might disagree with both. But that's the kind of education that I think it's behind what Montaigne is, and I think it's the kind of liberal education that I'm talking about here. I don't know whether that answered your question at all. It's a tough question, but he does despise the brutality and the force. He despises the force used in the French education system, and that's one of the most important things he insists on in the essay on the education of children. Kind of freedom, that they should be raised for freedom.
It's tough because we don't stop learning and changing. So, you know, you talk about traditions or whatever. We don't. Some of us at least try to keep open.
Sure.
At a particular age, they stop and set up. So there's that question about how do you teach everybody who doesn't need to have $50,000 for an education?
Well, yeah, that's a big question.
Marvelous discussion, and it evoked a great response. But I know somebody who needs to listen to this more than us. I noticed you have the virtue of civility, in which civility is a noun. You could almost make civility into a verb, the civility of virtue. But I would like your response, your opinion on another aspect. It's not only virtuous, it's also prudent. Let me give you two scenarios. If you fight with everybody all the time, you're being controlled. And I don't think that's a good situation to be in. On the other hand, if you know where the other person is coming from, you could tailor your response, and most of the time, you can get your way. I'd like your opinion on that.
Well, I haven't quite figured that out. Well, yeah, I mean, I think when Montaigne talks about his openness and his frankness, one of the ways he talks about that is in the context of being a mediator between princes, Henry III and Henry of Navarre. And he talks about that role, and he says, you know, I have this very frank, open way about myself, and therefore I'm trusted, right? They all trust me. So he's putting forth this character. And I think that this is why everybody was willing to listen to him and to take his advice and to trust that he's not lying to them. In the negotiations, he says, I will never betray. You know, there are certain things I won't do. I won't betray anybody, and I won't lie to anybody. So I think that kind of fits with what you're talking about. It doesn't have to be confrontational at all, but it has to be open. And you have to feel that freedom to say what you really think without fear of being silenced or being met with derision or anger. I don't know if it always gets you your way, but that's the spirit of it. Brad?
Nice talking.
Thanks.
It seems to me that civility, as you talk about it, presumes reasonable goodwill between people.
Yeah.
And that it also includes the idea of fairness, and as currently interpreted in our world, fairness has been translated into the idea of equal time, equal voice, about fair and balanced news, fair and balanced reporting, this idea that everybody is potentially right, and so you need to let all voices flourish. What is the root? Is there room in this notion of fairness for the idea of evil? That is lack of intent. Well, if you're presuming that the world is full of nothing but goodwill, then can fairness ever win out? Can civility ever win out? Is it a realistic goal?
Well, civility can fail. It can fail. There's no guarantees, right? The point is that when you have civility, this is what you've got. And you do have, this is goodwill. That's a very good way to put it. And that's what I was trying to get at when I said there's something more basic than the law, right? And that is the goodwill we have to each other. Whichever party, as Montaigne says, we belong to, we have this goodwill to the other just because he's a member of this society, right? And that goodwill, if you try to unpack that, it would include a lot of things, right? Now, we're only talking about speech. I really limited it to speech, free speech. Of course there's evil in the world. And Montaigne talks about what he thinks that evil is. In fact, he re-ranks the virtues and vices of the tradition, right? So I'm not presenting civility as a kind of all-inclusive virtue that covers every possible situation, right? In fact, Montaigne says, and this gets a little deeper into the weeds than I thought we might get into the weeds, but he says you can form a society of wicked people. Just put them under the laws. Kant says the same thing. The Enlightenment philosopher Kant. He says you can have a nation of devils as long as you've got the right laws.
Legal philosophy hits again.
Yeah, right.
Legal philosophy was required where I went to law school. I'm familiar with these people.
So, I don't know if that helps, but civility is a very fragile thing. And it's certainly not enough to cover all aspects of life, but it's certainly, to my mind, it's almost like what turns our association with each other into something enjoyable. doesn't have to happen. Anybody who's been to department meetings knows that. May not happen, but if it does, it makes things enjoyable. It's a kind of like that. It makes it human. Makes it more human. It raises up social interaction out of the level of mere necessity and makes it free. That would be another way of putting it. Makes it free.
Would you comment on a recent law in Georgia having to do with no texting while driving and its face-off with civility?
That's one of those areas that came up before with Professor Menger. There are some things that, we feel like, well, we got to have a law to cover this. And I can understand that law. And I don't think anybody should text when driving. I think it's a terrible thing. On the other hand, I find some things very distracting when I'm driving, even though I don't ever even touch my phone when I'm driving, never have. That's not the only possible distraction you could have. And so that's a good point, because we're not going to have a law that forbids distracted driving. It's not possible to do that, right? Of course, you could have a law that, and given some of the terrible accidents that have happened when people were texting, it's very tempting to turn to the law for help. So I have no criticism of that law. But I'm just saying, as an example of the control of our freedom, it's a good example of, yeah, you could forbid that, but that doesn't mean driving is going to be safe.
Safer.
Maybe, yeah, safer.
You can
Okay.
have distracted driving, just having people in your car.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
why they try to limit the number of teenagers.
Okay, here's a question from me. In the process of which I will confess to lots of ego and anger. Granted, I would agree that we could, each and every one of us, be equated, identified by our judgment, and everyone's judgment is different. What about the situation in which I find myself, and I think many of you do, where lots and lots of people have judgment so much worse than ours? That just have totally wrong-headed ideas, wrong-hearted ideas, that bad enough to be wrong and indeed perhaps evil. And I suppose Montaigne, the civil thing to do would be to choose one's battles and use persuasion, right, and try and argue them around to more reasonable points of view. But that doesn't work, right? It so often doesn't work, and there's so many of them, and it enrages me. He said, when someone opposes me, he arouses my attention, not my anger. I got way past attention a long time. I'm just, and I don't have, enough constraint. I can hardly argue anymore because I just get so furious. Anyway, I don't know if that's a question or a comment, but do we have any? We've just got to hope that eventually persuasion will work. I don't know.
Well, civility does not depend on your success in persuading anybody. Civility means how you live with people that you can't persuade or that are not persuaded, although always there might be the possibility that they might be persuaded. So civility is, that's why I'm saying it's a virtue, you know, I mean, it's a kind of character that will, where you can live with people. I mean, look, it seems to me that when people destroy their friendships, they refuse to be friends because of politics, there's something wrong there. If you're really friends with somebody, you don't become not friends because you disagree about politics. That's what I'm talking about, a more fundamental bond than politics. Or husbands and wives, people getting divorced over politics. There's something wrong there. You may have to have a truce and say, okay, we're not going to talk about politics, right? You may have to do that, but the willingness to even do that is an affirmation that my friendship with you is more important to me than the fact that we disagree about politics.
That's what makes Thanksgiving dinners possible, right?
Exactly. Great.
So, following on with that and some other ideas, part of my question is, what is the notion of reciprocity in civility? So, for example, there are some people that I would not want to have a political discussion with, not because I disagree with them, but because my perception is that my ideas would not be treated with respect. They would not be listened to. So I'd be willing to listen to them, to try to understand their views, to try to respect their views, but my feeling would be that it would not be reciprocated. And that then merges into this idea of free speech on campus and speakers and so forth. And so it seems to me that there are two categories of speakers. Speakers who come with ideas that are different from mine, but come with the idea of engaging in discussion. And speakers who come maybe with ideas that are different from mine, but have no intention of engaging or respecting my ideas or respecting any differences. And it seems to me that there's a difference between those two, but does it make any functional difference in how one would treat those speakers? So in terms of permitting or not, I'm fully on board with the idea of free speech on the campus, and I think, when I was going to college and those sort of discussions among other, classmates and so forth with competing ideas, I think that's one of the joys of that. When one sort of approaches each other with this respect and so forth, this idea of civility, we disagree, but we're going to have this discussion and listen to each other. And cases in which there's a different dynamic. And so functionally, does one make any sort of distinction like that?
Well, to address that point first, I would say no. I wouldn't make that distinction. But on the other hand, I would say everybody's got the right to speak, but that doesn't mean everybody has to listen, right? You're not entitled to be listened to, right? But but to go back to the beginning of what you talked about, which I think is an excellent point, trust has to be mutual, right? The trust that's at the basis of civility. You can't be civil by yourself, right? It requires this reciprocity for there to be civility. And the less you encounter that, the more you become shut up within yourself and you don't dare say anything, right, anymore. So civility is it's not something that you can be by yourself. It has to be, you have to expect respect from the other, and when you don't get it, then the relationship, like in the smoking example, even that fleeting interaction, it fails in that case. So I would say yes, it has to be mutual, the trust. You have to go, and that what happens in society, the breakdown of civility in society, which we are experiencing, I think, is the breakdown of trust.
And truth.
And the willingness to speak truth and to hear truth.
Well, we've got 2 or 3 more minutes and one more
This
question.
lady in the back was.
Hello. I am talking to your point about how difficult it is for us to do anything except fight over the divide, or at least feel angry about it. And what has been helpful for me in exactly that question is to look at the work of actually 2 people recently. One of whom is Jonathan Haidt, who talks about 6 basically moral virtues, but not just the 2 sides of each moral virtue. And Lakoff, who a lot of his stuff he writes isn't relevant to me, but what is very relevant is that he traces back from a political point or stance right down to that individual's basic moral status on that. So there's a very basic morality, and that doing that, certainly for me, it has in some ways made it much easier for me to deal with someone's opposing views, which I feel are morally wrong, to understand and begin to see that they have a moral judgment which makes that point of view perfectly logical. That logic comes up from a moral judgment. For some ways, it comes up rationally in one way. For other people, it comes up rationally in another. And being 2 very different political stances. I'd like you to comment on that.
Well, I guess my comment would be, I think it is not civil, or it is not a civil disposition to confront someone who disagrees with you as assuming that that person is stupid and evil.
Or amoral.
Who said that?
Not necessarily as far as evil, just amoral.
Well,
moral.
yeah, but I wouldn't go so far as to say that there are no evil opinions, but I would say that I'm far more concerned about actions than opinion. In other words, I can entertain an opinion when you teach philosophy, and especially when you teach moral and political philosophy, you're entertaining all kinds of opinions. And what am I going to say? I'm not going to teach this philosopher. I'm not going to try to enter into his mind and think, why does he say what he's saying? Because I find his views repugnant in some way. So I think we're talking maybe on, there's one way of talking in a sort of theoretical way, where it's possible to entertain all kinds of opinions that you would never act on, right? But that's not really what you're talking about. You're talking about when we disagree with each other over public policy, let's say. And I just think that the way to go into that discussion is to assume, to give the person the benefit of the doubt. Your assumption is that this person is neither stupid nor evil.
Well, yes, thank you, that's very helpful.
And
I
thank
think
you.
we're saying the same thing, that someone's not stupid, they have got a moral sense underneath, they have got a moral compass, which I can recognize if I get out of the way of fighting over what their opinion up here is.
Yeah, well, let me just say one final thing on that. I think very, very often what I've found when I've disagreed with people and had long conversations with them, what I find out in the end, and sometimes we'll both come to the same conclusion.
School, I hardly understood it, so it took 70 years to understand. But because I'm a pediatrician, and I wonder that there's too much philosophy to adults. And the problem we have starts with children. So, I mean, it's fine to talk about civility, etc.
Conclusion that we both really do want what is good. We just have different opinions about how to get there. And if you assume that when you go into the discussion, you will be sympathetic, you will be more open, you may not change your mind, but you will see the other person as a person of goodwill. Now that could fail, I agree with that, but that I think is the disposition of the civil character.
Okay.